Traces of the Atlantic Civilization by Martin Freksa. Translated by Leon Stevens in collaboration with the author. Part 1. Approach. 1. Contours. A mental experiment. Given that the present human race should be destroyed, for which in very recent times new means have become abundantly available, but given also that certain human groups, which the reader as well as the writer might belong to, would survive this destruction of civilization for one reason or other, what would we do? First of all, we would have to struggle, using the most primitive means, searching for potable water, collecting flint. When we found a moment's calm, we would reflect on what had happened and how it could have been possible. But what could we tell our descendants about it? The perished civilization, which we would still remember, would be quite intangible for them, and yet we would certainly make every effort to explain that event to our children, and at least the most important aspects of its background. What we could tell them from our own experience they would probably find credible, even if they could not fully grasp it. But even in the next generation the transmitted knowledge would likely be doubted, for what these stories might tell, in hardly comprehensible language, of a previously existing civilization would no longer be first-hand information, and would have little in common with the rather primitive world of those now living. So, while civilizations would again be developed, the old stories would be passed on for many generations. At times they would be ignored and fall into oblivion, while at other times new research would be stimulated by their discovery. What could then be learned? Perhaps enough to know that there were once large agglomerations. It might be doubted whether the term cities could be applied, where a blockish style of concrete construction must have predominated, with misbegotten buildings umpteen cubits high, inexplicably, however, for how could people back then have transported the materials? Other ground plans would be discovered, which would be assigned to various categories of holy places. Perhaps archaeological finds would also reveal that these agglomerations were distributed over large regions, mainly on either side of the Atlantic, reaching to other parts of the world. Because signs of the remote civilization emerged so prominently on both sides of the Atlantic, the arcane texts would refer above all to Occidental countries called Europe and America. The extinct world would be given the corresponding name Atlantic civilization. An interesting question would be how in that remote time the people of the two main regions were able to communicate when the ocean, the fierce Atlantic, lay between. One of the most hotly argued hypotheses would state that people had sent messages across the ocean by means of telepathy, and in this way had developed similar living conditions. Concerning other questions about technology in the Atlantic civilization, this and that speculation would arise. And how might that world have been destroyed? Rumors and more rumors. Possibly our imagined future researchers could learn much more about us. It would depend above all on the extent to which they could understand our living conditions from the experience of their own. The more similar they are, naturally, the more easily those of ancient times can be understood. The subject-object relation, in this case between the state of development of a researching and that of a researched civilization, will play a large part in the present historical investigation. A backward glance. We today know better than those future scientists who think about us several thousand years hence in our mental experiment. We know at least, regarding the spread of our civilization, that during the last 5 centuries, through newly developed transatlantic shipping, complemented more recently by air traffic, migrants have gone to America, above all Europeans, and at the cost of the native populations have developed a way of life on a European model, so that living conditions on the two sides of the Atlantic have become increasingly similar. Before people began crossing that ocean half a millennium ago, it was reputed to be extremely murky. The farther back one goes by millennia in Atlantic history, the more one encounters the assertion that it was once a sea of mud. Mariners who ventured too far from coastal regions could become stuck in the mire, never to return. This was especially true of ships sailing from Western European and North African coasts, whereas Nordic seamen could sail out relatively far into the North Atlantic. 2.5 millennia before our time, when the oldest Egyptian knowledge concerning the island empire of Atlantis was brought to Greece by the Athenian Solon, and somewhat later written down by Plato, those who came into contact with this material then had an explanation for the otherwise inexplicable reports of the vast extent of mud in the Atlantic. As we can read in Plato, it came from the sudden destruction of the great island of Atlantis. Thereafter, the classical theory also says this ocean could not be crossed. With this mud in the Atlantic, we have one of the numerous traces of Atlantis this book intends to show. Although it was evidently tangible for sailors, it is not so any longer, and this is the case with almost all traces pointing to Atlantis. Practically all of them have been preserved only in the human mind. Therefore we must, in the first place, probe the minds that bore them. The classical Atlantis theory arose during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, named Axis period, Achsenzeit, by the philosopher Karl Jaspers. It stands midway between our time and the beginning of history, as distinguished from prehistory, as this term is universally understood in our time. Those centuries were a time of crisis throughout civilization, which produced a flourishing of human culture. In Greece alone it brought forth such men as Heraclitus, Pythagoras, and Socrates. Wise Solon, whose Egyptian knowledge was later passed on to Socrates' disciple Plato, also belongs to that period. Thence came the knowledge of Atlantis, which for some time was passed on in Europe and ignored, forgotten for a long time afterward, and since the beginning of the modern era has been passed on again. In this book the view will be found that the Atlantis theory which arose in the Axis period, or as we say in classical Greece, needs no correction on any point, but it can be considerably extended, and solutions for its central unsolved problems can be offered. This, however, and the reasons will be discussed thoroughly in what follows, only after 2.5 millennia in our time. One of the unsolved problems of the classical theory is dating the end of Atlantis. Apart from a span of various millennia as a time frame for this event, here Plato gives no help. Occasionally, however, his work has been read differently, at times with severe consequences for the progress of research. The reason lies in the difficulty of interpreting half a sentence, a not unimportant detail, which with the help of the original Greek text will be made clear. Seen on the whole, a much more important question is how we can arrive at a sufficiently exact dating for the destruction of Atlantis. To this end there are several ways which will be described in the course of the presentation. They all lead back 2.5 millennia, as seen from the Axis period, directly to that threshold which the 20th century has fixed as the break between history and prehistory. Here historical consciousness ends and the historical unconscious begins. This threshold, supremely important in human history, can be likened to a trauma that an individual has suffered as the result of a serious accident, for which he somehow feels guilty. In such a case, the power of memory can reach back to the time of the accident, while the circumstances leading to it seem to be obliterated, and it can take a long, even a very long time for the individual to reach the point that something of what has been obliterated in the conscious mind can again be remembered. At this threshold, here only briefly described, there is an event of enormous destruction, which is referred to by the oldest and most consecrated texts of humankind in all the great traditions, including the records of the Great Flood. Throughout the presentation, it will be investigated from various points of view. As illustrated by a document rediscovered by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century and carefully guarded until the beginning of the 20th, Atlantis research, for which at all times the question of greatest interest has been what lies hidden behind the destruction of the island, also began at this threshold. Only after some 5,000 years, a few years ago, could this enigma be elucidated in perfect consonance with the classical theory, not by me, I hasten to add. I have picked up and worked out an essential clue which has greatly furthered the exploration of such complex material. About the structure of this work. The presentation progresses historically. From chapter to chapter, the emphasis of the examination is on succeeding eras, or even epochs alone, in which the concern is always what was and what could be known about the question during that time, so that consideration of historical circumstances and their characteristic modes of thought is very important. Regarding form, the text is a guide. That is, the subject matter will be developed in its major features. In this way, a number of hints and suggestions will be given, especially in the notes, in the hope that others will further investigate what is here only touched upon. In the appendices, which are treated step by step, there are some excerpts from related texts, which come from Sumerian, pre-classical, and classical Greek, Native American, and Indian traditions. A number of these texts, as well as some other useful sources, are unknown in recent Atlantic research, so far as I can determine. Let us begin the journey through world history. 3. Records of the Great Flood. Of all the stories about the Great Flood, that of the biblical deluge is the one best known to our tradition. For Noah, as the Old Testament book of Genesis relates, 6:13, the catastrophe was not unforeseen, rather it was announced to him. This happened in the time of the giants, the renowned mighty men of prehistoric times, as they are also called, Genesis 6:4. They were likewise famed among the Greeks. Their forefather, Atlas, was honored by the Greeks as a demigod. According to Greek mythology, he had borne the world on his shoulders. Diodorus Siculus describes him as a famed astrologer of remote times who had great knowledge of the spheres. His successors, however, sustained an evil memory among the Greeks, for the Gigantes had once made war on them. Luther translated the biblical expression as tyrants, tyrannen, which in the context of Greek records appears completely justified. As will later be shown, the expression giants comes from the memory of outsized stone figures in an Egyptian temple depicting representatives of that perished people. Still in the time of the giants, then, according to the Bible, the catastrophe was announced to Noah and to no one else, for he walked with God, and the wickedness of man was great in the earth. In the Bible, Noah, as the figure who consciously experiences the times before, during, and after the catastrophe, is a mediator among them. His preparation against the threatening annihilation is described as the construction of an ark. In other traditional Hebrew stories, he is portrayed as a prophet who preached for decades, whom many refused to hear and even ridiculed, so that finally he was forced to leave his native land. The form of the ark is described as a cube which shelters all living creatures. Whether these particulars are to be regarded in a literal or allegorical sense will be dealt with later. Genesis describes the flood as an enormous event. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth. It is told how many cubits the water reached above the mountain tops, and also how many months Noah's ark drifted until it landed on Mount Ararat, and how many more months passed until the water had fully receded, as indicated by birds that he sent out. When the flood had ended, he built an altar and made a sacrifice. In the biblical version, only he and his family survived, 8 people altogether, warranting the admonition, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth." Among the Iranians, the story was told differently, without the element of the ark. Yima, father of humankind, was warned by the god Ahura Mazda of a great catastrophe. The god also ordered him to lay out a park where all living creatures could dwell, and to light a fire in it. A great flood came. Everything was destroyed except that park, which is called the Garden of Yima. The Indian sacred scriptures give several stories on the theme. In part, they reflect motifs of the Semitic Hebraic tradition. The Vedas tell how Man, a father of humankind like Yima, came upon a fish that swelled to an extraordinary size and announced to him a great flood. In response to this annunciation, he built a ship, which the fish led, when the deluge came, until it ran aground in the Himalayas. Since then, the way to India from the Himalayas has been called Manu's Descent. So far, we have considered the flood stories from national territories to which, demonstrably, Semites migrated. Some elements appear to be borrowings from them, others seem to be local variations. What about the stories in the areas occupied by Hamites? The Hamitic line led from Mesopotamia to the west. Nevertheless, through migrations back to the east and Hebrew migration to Egypt, strong connections with the Semites were established. In the Hamitic settlement areas, there are two very different traditions concerning the Great Flood. That found in the Quran is very similar to the Semitic, specifically Hebrew, tradition. Noah is named, details of the ark are mentioned. Essentially, the differences are only stylistic. The narrative found in the Quran may be borrowed from the Semites, or both stories may have a common source. Noah himself comes readily to mind. At first sight, the other sort of stories have little in common with those discussed to this point, except that they also deal with this catastrophe. With the other tradition, the question is raised how ancient knowledge could have been preserved in spite of the Great Flood. According to the great Egyptian historian Manetho, Thoth, also called Hermes Trismegistos, sometimes exalted as the god of history, wrote valuable knowledge on a pillar long before the great catastrophe. Afterwards, the second Thoth, or Taut, inventor of writing, was able to translate these documents, and he mentioned the Great Flood. Ibn al-Balkhi, a medieval Persian scholar on the same subject, says that the wise men had foreseen a catastrophe either by water or by fire. Therefore, he says, 2 very large pyramids were built in Upper Egypt, in which fundamental knowledge was inscribed. Akbar al-Masudi, a medieval Egyptian historian, clarifies some details of this matter. One of the kings before the Great Flood, named Surid, ordered the building of 2 large pyramids in which the priests were to set down written tokens of their wisdom and techniques of the arts and sciences, so that people of the future, as long as they understood the writing, could profit from it. In addition, the positions and cycles of the stars were set down, along with lists of historical events and predictions of the future. The Jewish-Roman historian Josephus has this to say on that subject. When the destruction of the earth, be it by fire or flood, had been prophesied, the descendants of Set, experienced in astronomy, erected 2 pillars, one made of brick, the other of stone. The one made of stone, he says, had remained intact and was in his time to be found in Syria. When we look into the sources of Plato's Atlantis account, we shall deal in detail with records of this sort. Here it suffices to note that in contrast with the stories and traditions related to this point, which tell how people were saved in various ways during the Great Flood, there is a particular sort of literature whose main concern is how writings, stone inscriptions, were saved. The stories of this peculiar sort point to Egypt as their origin. We move now to those areas where the line of Japhet extended its influence, from Mesopotamia principally to the north and along the southern part of Europe to the west. How was the story of the Great Flood told by the peoples who settled there? The Greeks vaguely remembered various rather disastrous floods along their coasts, but the greatest by far, that of Deucalion, was told of in detailed stories with many variants. They tell, to make it short, that Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were the only survivors. Warned by Prometheus that Zeus intended to annihilate the people of the Bronze Age, Thessalonian variant, he built a ship with the help of Prometheus. When the Great Flood came, reaching nearly to the peaks of the highest mountains, the couple were taken up in their ship and landed after 9 days on Mount Parnassus, above Delphi. Some other high mountains in Greece are also named. As the end of the story tells, they provided for the repopulation of humanity by throwing stones over their shoulders, from which male and female creatures sprang. In details such as the number of survivors and the duration of the flood, the Greek telling differs from the Semitic and Hamitic versions. But the element of a watercraft characteristic of the latter traditions also occurs in the Greek stories. One can therefore assume an influence of these two cultures, or a common origin of the stories told by Semitic, Hamitic, and Japhetic peoples. The second possibility would most naturally correspond to the common point of origin of their migrations, the mountains north of Mesopotamia. Besides stories of this sort, however, in Greece there is a very different tradition that deals with the subject, which is linked with the names of Plato and Solon, with Pythagoras as well in a certain sense, who in their turn are linked with Egyptian tradition. Because these connections will later be discussed extensively, let them be merely noted for now. The Celts, with whom certain descendants of the Gomerians intermixed, knew a story of the great flood which bears similarities with that of Deucalion and Pura. In the Welsh version, when the sea of waters, Llunllion, erupted, it drowned everyone except Dwyfan and Dwywach, who were saved in a sailless ship, a remote echo of Noah's crate. The Celtic priests, the Druids, deemed that flood a purification of humankind. The ancient Scandinavians, or Germanic peoples, who came into relatively late contact with the Japhetic line, told the most peculiar flood story to be found among the Europeans. The blood of boar flowed so copiously, the entire race of giants was drowned in it. Bergelmir and his wife, the only people remaining, were saved in a boat. Here not only is the earth drowned, it is bleeding from its deepest wound. It is notable that the giants, who according to these traditional tales met with a special fate in the catastrophe, total annihilation, were not unknown to the Scandinavians. The saving of a couple in a boat recalls the Celtic story. Now we come to the peoples whose habitation areas are farthest removed from Mesopotamia, the Chinese and the ancient Americans. In both directions, the possible influence of flood stories having a Mesopotamian origin can be quite clearly evaluated. As far as the Chinese are concerned, it can practically be ruled out. The early migrations from Mesopotamia, though they extended as far as India, show no connection with China. Only at a much later time, in the last 300 or 400 years, a certain sway of the Christian tradition could have been felt. The Christians, though, who lived there during these times in small numbers, in Shanghai, for instance, could hardly, with their knowledge of the biblical flood story, have made a notable mark on the Chinese tradition. The case of the native Mesoamericans is quite different. The Spanish conquerors and missionaries had such a tremendous influence on them from the 16th century onward that their cultural records were largely destroyed. However, what has been saved regarding the Great Flood cannot have been altered by the telling of stories originating in Mesopotamia. I stress the aspect of possible influence for this reason. In Europe, the Great Flood has occasionally been viewed as a purely Mesopotamian phenomenon. This is even true of the archaeologist Leonard Woolley, who reopened the debate in the 20th century. To a certain degree, that position has its justification, for as will be seen, reasons to believe that the flood waters remained there on the lowlands longer than in many other regions have since come to light. We have observed besides that the Mesopotamian manner of relating the deluge, most recognizable in the description of a watercraft, ark, etc., as the means of salvation, had a strong influence on the flood stories of many peoples. This can easily be explained by the migration routes they took from Mesopotamia. Apart from that, it has a very general character, as we shall soon see. The Chinese have recorded, "The Emperor Yao saw how masses of water crashed against the mountains and slowly rose against their flanks. Millions were drowned." The Chinese, an English sinologist writes, were of the opinion that the entire world was once flooded. They described the flood thus: "The pillars of heaven are broken. The earth is shaken to its foundations. The earth was rent. And the waters that were hidden in her womb broke forth mightily and covered the land. Man had rebelled against heaven. The world was in chaos. After the flood, they say, Fu-He appeared and made his descent from the Qin mountains. It is obvious what a great matter this catastrophe must have been for the Chinese of antiquity. Although the records of this sort relate colossal events, they are comparatively sober and straightforward. Nothing is said about any special means of survival, neither an ark nor anything of the kind. There is no reason to assume that this sort of record is anything but Chinese in origin. The Native American peoples have various stories about the Great Flood. They are easily separated into those under Christian influence, which bear a more or less strongly Mesopotamian stamp, and those that show an original character. Here in brief is the first type. When the Great Flood came, Koch and his wife Xochiquetzal were saved in a skiff which also carried children, animals, and corn. In order to find out whether the flood had receded, Koch sent out birds. Corn is very important to the Native Americans. All the other elements are known to the Semitic, Hebrew, Greek, etc. tradition. Another story says, the waters of the flood rose 15 cubits above the mountains. The number for the height of the waters above the mountains is cited only in the Bible. This imitation of the biblical story is of no further interest here, but the following story bears retelling. An animal fable is woven in, which, like all authentic fables, harbors a deep human meaning. The father of the people lived in the land of the rising sun. Warned in a dream of a great flood, he built a large ship and brought in animals to talk with them. The flood rose ever higher, and the journey became ever longer. Then the animals began to bleat against their protector. When they were saved in the new land, they lost the ability to speak in punishment for their bleatings. Now to the other sort of American stories to which no Judeo-Christian influence can be attributed. From the records of the Incas, Peruvian highlands. During the catastrophe of the flood, which only a few people in the Andes survived, a llama led its master to a high peak where other animals had already gathered. After 60 days and nights, humans, llamas, and wild beasts descended from the mountains, and from that time the earth was repopulated. From the Chinalpopoca Codex of the Aztecs, Mexican highlands. In a single day all was lost. In a single day even the mountains sank under the water. From an Andes record, Bolivia and northwest Brazilian highlands. The people fleeing the great flood sought refuge in caves. There were volcanic eruptions. The human race was destroyed. From the Popol Vuh of the Maya, the scripture most highly respected in Central America. With the flood came whirlwinds, darkness, rain, day and night. The people tried to escape by all possible means. A great noise was heard as if of fire. Water and fire brought universal destruction at the time of the last great cataclysm before the fourth creation. All these narratives of Native American origin have a high information content. It is especially to be noted that here both water and fire are spoken of as factors of the catastrophe. It is sufficiently clear that there exist records of the Great Flood all over the world, of which only a brief selection is presented here. More yet, some of them can be judged to be completely independent of one another. This is true at least of the ancient American, ancient Chinese, and Mesopotamian records, whose influence upon one another can be ruled out. Other records of the Great Flood, especially those of Egypt, but also of Iran, India, and Scandinavia, must be regarded as at least partly independent. In the Greek and Celtic records, a relatively strong influence of the Mesopotamian tradition can be seen. With this we come back to a still unresolved problem posed at the beginning of this chapter. Which elements of the Great Flood stories are to be understood allegorically and which historically? I would like to treat this question with the aid of a text that is especially appropriate in this context. Examination of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The version of the Epic of Gilgamesh here considered is the richest, most complete, and latest of several. There are predecessors, the earliest of which points, as will later be seen, to Sumerian times, strictly speaking, the first half of the 3rd millennium BC. Important fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Old Babylonian version, date from approximately the time of Hammurabi, around 1600 BC, famed for his great legal code. The last important version, the Assyrian, is usually ascribed to the time of Ashurbanipal, the 7th century BC. The different versions of the epic coincide then with different periods of cultural flourishing, which always meant as well that a Mesopotamian power was attempting to extend its dominion from the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean, two key points in the development of navigation. The Epic of Gilgamesh is in many respects a flower of those times, because in it the oldest Mesopotamian knowledge was united in epic form with a germinating new knowledge of the world beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. Supposing the reader has begun the excerpted fragments of the epic in Appendix 1, it will soon be clear that Gilgamesh is searching for death and life. This search has two dimensions, the existential for the hero himself and that of human history. He had come to the cedar forests with his friend Enkidu when Enkidu met his death. In deepest sorrow, Gilgamesh wanders on, asking everyone where he might find his ancestor Utnapishtim, who is said to have found eternal life. Those who can help him direct him along the way to a well-known ferryman, said to have anchored his ship beyond the Lebanese forests. By toilsome paths he at last reaches that place and finds the man he is seeking. By means of a ruse he obtains the other's consent to take him on the long journey to Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh and the ferryman are now on the Lebanese coast, in the eastern Mediterranean, called Phoenicia in the 2nd millennium BC. From there the epic sea voyage begins. A run of a month and 15 days they left behind by the 3rd day. Urshanabi arrived thus at the waters of death. Here we have highly significant information. As in a miracle voyage, they crossed the sea very quickly, in 3 days, although the time ordinarily required is an estimated 45 days, a month and 15 days. What is the direction of this journey? This essential question can be answered by attentive reading of the epic if we take into account the contours of the Mediterranean and use simple logic. It is clear that the ferryman knows the way. He was sent by Utnapishtim, and the point of departure is given. And now they travel in a certain direction as far as a normal ship would need 45 days to cover. Of all directions one might think of, the west is the only one possible, for any other goes to a continental coast. And even after a journey that would ordinarily need 45 days, still the ship's helmsman has not reached a coast. He reaches the waters of death. The authors of this epic could not have said anything more about geography in the West, not at least until the time of the Assyrian Empire. The ferryman and Gilgamesh cross this threshold very mysteriously using barge poles as in a swamp, and there is his ancestor waiting for them. And now Gilgamesh inquires about the deepest knowledge of Utnapishtim, the one transported. In response, his ancestor tells the story of the Great Flood. He tells it as a factual story in the first-person form of one who survived it. Once he had lived in the city of Shuruppak in Mesopotamia. There he was warned of a great flood by the voice of the wind.
"Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubartutu, tear down this house, build a ship, give up possessions, seek thou life, forswear worldly goods, and keep the soul alive. Aboard the ship take thou the seed of all living things. The ship that thou shalt build, her dimensions shall be to measure, equal shall be her width and her length."
Like Noah, Utnapishtim is admonished to preserve existence, to save life. The Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh seem to compete in trying to find ways of expressing this. According to the former, a pair of every creature was taken into the ark. Here, the seeds of every living thing. In addition, in both scriptures the geometrical form of the ship is stressed. That sort of knowledge is also worthy of salvation. The particular form and dimensions of the oversized watercraft, however, also incidentally the time that they were underway, differ considerably in the two scriptures, which argues against historical content in these details. Next comes the presentation of the catastrophe. Its principal features are thunder, fire as if of torches, darkness, a hurricane, and, as a hint, an earthquake, and of course the great flood covering mountains. Here the indications are more detailed than in the Old Testament. Some of them are also found in Central American and Chinese descriptions. The gods were frightened by the deluge, and shrinking back they ascended to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. How can one gloss such words? The gods, who themselves provoked the flood, cringe like dogs in fear. Finally, the saving of Utnapishtim and his people. The ark lands on Mount Nizar. He sends out birds. A thankful sacrifice is made. Mount Nizar is a further geographical clue. Many take this mountain to be one of those in the highland dominating Mesopotamia. This area, then, would be the same as the one given in the Bible, the region around Mount Ararat. As in Genesis, the poem relates the saving of an important person, and the people with him are mentioned more or less incidentally. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Utnapishtim's wife and of handicraft masters. The Bible speaks more specifically of Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, and their respective wives. The epic also contains the familiar Mesopotamian detail of survival in a watercraft. Now the question arises, what should we gather from being saved in a watercraft? In my opinion, this element is not historical, not at all factual. In this respect, I do not hold the view that the very old traces of wood and of a huge plot of land, possibly an enclosure lying above 1,800 meters in the Ararat region, have anything to do with a watercraft. All this might have something to do with Noah or Utnapishtim, Babylonian Zeusudra, but surely not with a ship. Among the many stories about this vessel, there are hardly 2 that even nearly agree on the shape or dimensions, an indication that they have been imagined again and again. Besides this, non-biblical sources say that Noah emigrated when persecuted in the city of his birth, and regarding the direction of his migration, everything suggests Mount Ararat. These records do not say that Noah was carried away in a watercraft during the Great Flood. Nevertheless, this particular element of the Mesopotamian tradition is to my mind a stroke of narrative genius. With a single symbol, something is clarified that is indeed difficult to make clear, how the most vital knowledge of humankind could be saved in the most devastating catastrophe, by sealing it up in a ship, or even more symbolically expressed, in an ark. The Greek word includes meanings of the old and the new, which can be taken as the rebirth of culture. And this ark as a ship fits wonderfully into the circumstance of the mighty flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, therefore, as in the Bible, mathematics plays a role in the form of the ship. Let her breadth and length be equal. Geometrical knowledge is, so to speak, inscribed in the ship itself. In the Epic it is a cube. In the same way, the beautiful allegory of the Epic arises, in which the ship is a savior of the seed of every living thing, symbolism which includes knowledge of agriculture and stock breeding. The most valuable feature the Epic of Gilgamesh offers to our investigation is the great curve it spans between Mesopotamia and a location beyond the then-known western route through the Mediterranean. And it does this in one and the same figure, the great wise man Utnapishtim. He comes from an identified Mesopotamian city today called Farah in Iraq, which indicates that he is a historical person, doubtlessly identical to Noah. And in the epic he is literally transported to a location described as the waters of death, in which Gilgamesh can move only with an experienced companion using big barge poles. The poem can say nothing more about this place. For all experts on the Mediterranean region at that time, the area in question meant the end of the world, and this in a threefold sense: geographically, the end of the world that had till then been explored; historically, the end of a previously existing world; and metaphorically the death of the world. With masterful art, the anonymous author has Utnapishtim transported to the field of death and has him tell the story of the great flood from there. It is as if the authors were saying, between this field of death, whose geography we have described as clearly as possible, and the great flood, which we know of in our Mesopotamian tradition, there is a connection. We cannot really explain it, but we can pass this notion on. Prospect. Records of the Great Flood exist throughout the world. All these documents and traditions speak of an event whose dimensions must be measured by the heights of mountains. They also speak of the destruction of the human race and survivors on high mountains. To this extent they deal, in my view, with a historical fact that affected widely separated parts of the earth. In treating the development and expansion of early civilizations, we must consider above all the following regions where small splinters of humanity survived: the Upper Nile highlands, those dominating Mesopotamia, the Iranian, Indian, and Chinese, the Central and South American and Scandinavian highlands, the Pyrenees, the Alps, and Mount Parnassus, close to the Delphic sanctuary, a catalogue that will be supplemented. As we shall see, Plato's Atlantis account also speaks of a flood that destroyed all humanity, which only those living on high mountains could have survived. Such a flood or tidal wave must therefore have risen to enormous dimensions, which can be evaluated by a number of indications and data, and I would commend the reader not to scorn these notions, even though, after the considerations to this point, they cannot yet be fully understood in their causal connections. The Arabian scholar Abu Abdallah el-Idrisi, the most important geographer of the Middle Ages, in his study of the Atlas Mountains in northwest Africa, came to the conclusion that during a tremendous catastrophe, seawater had reached a height of 11 stadia, about 2,000 meters. Without giving measurements, Herodotus had already pointed to Egyptian reports of mussel shells and salt water in the Upper Nile highlands. In Plutarch there is the notion that the destructive power of the deluge reached almost to the European tree line. Interpreting certain mystery cults, he remarks that the surviving men of the time following the great catastrophe could be very glad when they found acorns or beechnuts. The limits of a seawater flood that have been noticed in certain mountainous areas can only indicate the maximum reach of one or more tidal waves, but not the temporal extent of flooding on the plains. Indications vary on this point from region to region. According to Greek or Delphic records, the water seems to have retreated after days or weeks, whereas the Bible gives indications that it remained for several months. This is plausible because Mesopotamia describes the shape of a funnel, where especially great quantities could be collected, making possible the production of a corresponding backwater. It is known furthermore that the southernmost part of Mesopotamia near the ocean, where the water was possibly contained, was uninhabitable when Ur was resettled. In some regions of Central Asia, the post-diluvian seawater evidently stayed for an even longer time, especially in the region of the Tarim Basin, where great masses of water, called the Mongolian Sea, remained enclosed even centuries after the Great Flood. The geography of that basin, surrounded by mountain chains which, especially in the northeast, could have been overtopped by the Great Flood, allowed them to collect. Only in the later 3rd millennium B.C. did this water flow off, very suddenly, traditional records say, probably because of a break in a natural dam, which caused, as research on the subject indicates, a regional catastrophe. Interestingly, in the mountains of Central Asia there are also plainly visible lines of demarcation which the Mongols or their Cossack successors regarded as the highest markings of the deluge. For above them the stones are old and weathered, while below accumulations of sand, clay, gravel, and scree appear, which have the character of deposits. Von Schwarz, citing von Richthofen, states that the most plainly visible demarcation lines in western Central Asia reach to a height of some 1,500 meters, while in eastern Central Asia the level descends to around 1,200 meters. These findings correspond in a certain way with the findings of el-Idrisi, who detected like markings at a height of approximately 2,000 meters in the Atlas Mountains. This correspondence can be explained with the help of the important Atlantis investigator Otto Muck, a natural scientist whose way of thinking we will discuss later. In the 20th century, he came to the conclusion, independently of Idrisi, that in high mountains the flood could have reached a height of up to 2,000 meters in continental Europe. For Muck it was clear that the center from which the great flood arose lay in the middle of the Atlantic. If for the moment we take as given that the maximum swelling of the waters occurred in the high mountains at the Atlantic coast, northwest Africa, Spain, then it is obvious that the height of the tidal waves had to decrease with the distance from there, which demonstrate that the demarcation lines descend in height about 800 meters from the Atlantic coastal area to eastern Central Asia. As history is understood today, it would be pointless to speak of the flood as a historical fact if this event were not datable. Initially, I mentioned a threshold of our historical consciousness which separates a dark pre-time from a historical time and which lies near the transition from the 4th to the 3rd millennium BC, immediately before Sumer, Egypt, and other early civilizations developed in their respective regions. We reached the same time through Woolley's archaeological findings of the flood. More accurate calculations can be made using the diligently researched datings of Flavius Josephus, regarding which some groundwork has already been given. With the help of his figures, the Great Flood can be dated around 3100 BC, plus or minus 1 century. This result, derived from the extensive works of this great historian, can be examined by a rough but relatively simple calculation with the help of the number of named forefathers that Luke gives for the genealogical tree of Jesus of Nazareth. If the number given by Josephus, 3100, is divided by the number according to Luke, 65 forefathers back to Shem's son Arphaxad, born a few years after the Great Flood, then one arrives at a mean difference of 48 years between generations, which is still in a natural frame. It appears relatively high, nevertheless, probably because it was not possible for Luke to establish a complete list. Proceeding from these remarks on dating the Great Flood, which will be completed by further sources, and the date will also be narrowed in its limits, we must calculate using a time toward the end of the 4th millennium BC. This dating will be valid for the Great Flood, having the characteristics by which it has been described in this chapter as a historical event, and will also be valid for a step-by-step crystallization of the event with which the immediate cause of the Great Flood will finally be made clear.